Raindrops pattered against the window pane, and in the hazy glow of the late afternoon, Emily stood quietly, her sad brown eyes gazing out at the desolate garden in the distance. But then a low, raspy voice broke through her swirling thoughts. "Emily, I need to tell you something." It was James, the mysterious man who had swept into her life like a gust of wind. He knelt before her, his clothes soaked through, clutching a small ring engraved with the name Lily. "I used to think I didn't deserve to love anyone, didn't deserve happiness after what happened to Lily. But you've shown me that love can heal anything." Emily interrupted, her voice trembling. "James, But he pressed on, determined. "Let me finish. I promised to spend my whole life loving and protecting you. Emily, will you marry me?" She ran out into the rain, tears mixing with laughter. "You idiot! Yes, I will." James pulled her into his arms, whispering, "Thank you, Emily. You're my light." "Do you want to know the story behind this proposal?" The narrator's voice chimed in, warm and inviting. "This isn't just a romantic moment, it's the pinnacle of Emily and James's journey of healing and love. Stick around until the end to discover how they found each other, overcame the darkness, and built a happy family. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter." Wedding music filled the air, mingling with the chatter and laughter of the crowd. Sophia, Emily's cousin, was getting married in a breathtaking setting. Fresh flowers lined the aisles, crystal chandeliers sparkled like stars, and the bride glowed in her pristine white gown. But Emily sat alone at a corner table, twirling her wineglass, her eyes lost amidst everyone else's joy. She wasn't jealous of Sophia, nor was she upset about the wedding. No, it was an old pain resurfacing, sharp as a rose's thorn piercing her heart. "Emily, why do you look like you're at a funeral?" Her mother, Clara, approached, her tone teasing but laced with concern. "It's Sophia's big day. Smile a little." Emily forced a half-smile, but it couldn't hide the bitterness bubbling inside. "Mum, how can I smile when the whole family knows I'm the spinster? This is the 10th wedding this year. I've been a bridesmaid every time, but never the bride. And I'm older than Sophia." Clara chuckled, patting her daughter's shoulder. "Oh, come on, you're only 29. Still plenty young. You're beautiful, smart. Who wouldn't fall for you? You just haven't met the right guy yet." Emily shook her head, her gaze drifting away. Her mum didn't get it. Maybe no one did. She wasn't just lonely because she was single. She'd loved before, a deep secret love that had shattered her. Back in college, she'd met David, a kind-hearted guy from her design class. They'd spent late nights sketching under dim lamplight, sipping cold coffee, and falling for each other like autumn leaves carried by the breeze. David had given her a silver bracelet, its delicate patterns etched with care, promising it was forever. But when he wanted to take things further, her family shut it down. Her father, Henry, roared, "If you dare keep seeing that boy, don't call me your father." Clara had cried, insisting David wasn't stable enough for her. Under the pressure, David left. No goodbye, just a text. "I don't want to make things hard for you." Emily had sobbed until she had no tears left, clutching that silver bracelet like it was all she had of her broken heart. She told herself she'd move on, but today at Sophia's wedding, she saw him, David, sharp in a black suit, standing with another girl, flashing the gentle smile she'd once dreamed was hers. He nodded at her from afar, then turned away, as if she were just a faded memory. "Emily, what's wrong?" Clara noticed her daughter's pale face, her voice tinged with worry. "Are you feeling sick?" Emily snapped out of it, shaking her head. "I'm fine, Mom, just tired." She didn't want her mum digging up the past or anyone knowing the pain she'd buried. But deep down, she was exhausted, tired of loneliness, family expectations, and losing the one person she'd loved. Clara sighed, pulling a chair up beside her. "I know you're upset about all this, But look around. There, plenty of single guys are milling around this party. Who knows, you might meet someone." Emily smirked, her smile dripping with sarcasm. "You make it sound like I'm picking out veggies at the market. I don't want just anyone, Mom. I want someone special, someone you and Dad would approve of, someone who'd help me take care of the family, and—" She paused, her fingers brushing the silver bracelet in her pocket. "Someone who'd make me believe in love again." Clara blinked, then burst out laughing. "My daughter's a hopeless romantic." "Fine, I'm on board. Just don't sit here embarrassing me. Go talk to someone. Maybe fate's waiting." Emily didn't reply, slipping the bracelet out of her pocket to study it under the chandelier's glow. The tarnished patterns brought back memories of David, days when she'd believed in happiness. She didn't dream of him anymore, but she longed for a fresh start, not to please her family, but to heal herself. Just then her eyes wandered through the crowd and landed on a man near the buffet table. He was tall and lanky, with messy black hair and a pensive gaze fixed out the window, detached from the party's cheer. Something about him, a quiet sadness like hers, sparked her curiosity. "I'm grabbing more water," Emily muttered to her mum, standing up. She wasn't thirsty, she just needed to escape the stifling corner. As she walked, her hand tightened around the bracelet, but a gust from an open window yanked it free. It hit the floor with a faint clink. The stranger turned, his deep eyes locking onto hers. He bent down, picked it up, and gave her a faint smile. "Is this important to you?" His voice was low, carrying a hint of mystery. Emily froze, her heart racing. "Thank you. It used to be." She reached for it, but he held onto it, his gaze piercing as if he could see right through her. "I'll give it back later," he said, then walked off, leaving Emily reeling with 1,000 thoughts. She didn't know who he was, but that feeling, like fate had just sparked, kept her eyes glued to him. A sharp knock echoed through the spacious office, shattering the stillness of the late afternoon. James Salvador sat behind his polished walnut desk, his piercing eyes locked on the newspaper in his hands. The article about the stock market held no interest for him anymore, not because it was dull, but because his mind had drifted elsewhere, to a place where painful memories lingered like ghosts that refused to let go. The door swung open, and Daniel, James's personal assistant, stepped in, hesitation written all over his face. "Sir, I just received a message from your parents. They'd like to invite you to dinner tonight. Are you free?" James didn't look up, but his hand froze on the paper, knuckles whitening as he gripped it tighter. His voice cut through the room like ice. "How many times have I told you, Daniel? No messages from them. Tell them to stop bothering me. I don't have parents." Daniel swallowed hard, feeling the chill radiating from the man before him. He knew James wasn't easily swayed, but this time the steel in his boss's voice sent a shiver down his spine. "Yes, sir. I'll handle it. It won't happen again." As Daniel left, James dropped the newspaper onto the desk, his eyes staring blankly into the void. "Parents," he muttered, his tone dripping with sarcasm. To him, that word had died long ago. 3 years ago, to be exact, on the fateful day his little sister, Lily, left this world forever. He could still hear that night as if it were yesterday. The heated argument ringing through the sprawling Salvador family mansion. James, 27 at the time, had screamed at his parents, George and Rena, because they wouldn't let him help care for Lily, who was hospitalized with a lingering fever. "She needs me," James had roared, his eyes bloodshot with fury. "Why do you keep pushing me away? I'm her brother. I have a right to be there for her." Rena, her face weary and eyes shadowed with exhaustion, just shook her head. "James, you don't understand. We're trying to protect her. Let us handle this." But James wouldn't hear it. He slammed his fist on the table, shouting, "Protect her? All you care about is protecting this family's damn reputation. If you actually cared, Lily wouldn't be lying in that hospital alone." Then he stormed out, fueled by rage, leaving his stunned parents behind, and Lily, the frail 15-year-old, overhearing everything from her upstairs bedroom. That night, Lily vanished. She'd secretly packed a small suitcase and scribbled a note. "I'm going to find Mum. I don't want to stay here anymore." When James returned the next morning, he found his parents in a panic by the phone, George's trembling voice announcing that Lily had been in an accident on her way to the airport. The car she was in skidded off the road in heavy rain, and she was gone forever, leaving James with a guilt that sank deep into his soul. From that day, James severed all ties with his parents. He blamed them for abandoning Lily, for not letting him be there for her. But deep down, he knew he was guilty too. If he hadn't fought with them, if he'd stayed that night, maybe Lily wouldn't have run off. That regret hardened into an icy wall around him, shutting out every attempt his family made to reach him, and shutting out parts of himself too. James stood, his steps heavy as he left the office. He drove to a familiar place, the city cemetery, where Lily rested. Under a grey sky, he stood before her gravestone, fists clenched tight. "Lily," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Why did you leave me? Why did they let you go like that? They sent you to your death, you know that? They don't deserve forgiveness." The wind howled, biting and cold, but James felt nothing but emptiness. He sank to his knees, pressing a hand to the stone as rare tears streaked down his face. "I'm sorry, Lily. I should have been there. I should have protected you." Just then, a soft cough sounded behind him. James flinched but didn't turn around, assuming it was just a passerby, not worth his attention, until a clear, gentle voice spoke up. "Hey, I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I heard you talking about your parents. Why don't you try forgiving them?" James stiffened, anger flaring in his chest. He whipped around, ready to snap at whoever dared meddle in his pain. But when his eyes met hers, he froze. It was Emily, dressed in a simple pale blue dress, her brown eyes shimmering with a depth of emotion that caught him off guard. She didn't flinch under his icy glare, just looked at him with a sincerity that threw him. "This is none of your business," James growled, trying to hold on to his armor. "Don't talk to me about things you don't understand." Emily didn't back down. She stepped closer, her voice still soft but firm. "I don't know your whole story, but I heard you say they're why your sister's gone. Have you ever thought, if you'd been there for her instead of blaming them, things might have turned out differently?" Her words stabbed into his heart like a blade. James shot to his feet, his eyes blazing with a mix of rage and pain. "Who are you to judge me? What do you know about my family, about what I've lost?" Emily shook her head, unshaken. "I'm not judging you. I just think family's precious. If you hold on to this anger forever, one day they'll be gone, and you'll regret it. I'm just a stranger, but I don't want to see anyone lose what I've already lost." James fell silent, staring at the girl in front of him. Something in her eyes, a deep, mirrored sadness, stopped him cold. Before he could respond, Emily knelt and placed a small white daisy on Lily's grave. "For your sister," she said, then turned and walked away, leaving James standing there, his mind a storm of confusion. He looked down at the daisy resting quietly on the stone, feeling like someone had just reached into his frozen heart after years of isolation. Who was she? Why did her words shake him like this? James didn't know, but deep inside a strange thought flickered to life. He wanted to know more about her. Not to argue, but to understand why she reminded him of Lily, his little sister who once believed love could conquer anything. The city cemetery basked in the lazy glow of a fading afternoon, the dimming sunlight casting a golden hue over rows of silent tombstones. A breeze swept through, carrying the scent of dry grass and the crisp chill of autumn, slipping between Emily's fingers as she walked along the gravel path. She wasn't here for any special occasion, just to find a sliver of peace by her grandparents' grave. her refuge whenever her heart grew heavy. Today, after Sophia's wedding, the ache of David and the weight of family expectations had driven her back to this quiet sanctuary, desperate for a moment to breathe. Emily paused before an weathered tombstone, setting down a small bouquet of white daisies. Her fingers gently traced the engraved names of her grandparents. "Grandma, Grandpa, I'm so tired," she whispered, her voice so soft even the wind could barely catch it. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore. Everyone's finding their happiness, and I'm just stuck watching from the outside." She sank down, leaning against the stone, her eyes fluttering shut as if she could escape reality for a while. That's when a low, gravelly voice cut through her thoughts from a distance. "They sent you to your death, you know that. They don't deserve forgiveness." The words dripped with pain, laced with a suppressed rage that felt like an old wound torn open. Emily's eyes snapped open, curiosity tugging her toward the sound. A few rows away, a tall man knelt before a grave, his dark hair tousled by the wind, his broad shoulders trembling faintly. She hadn't meant to intrude, but something in his voice gripped her, a rawness that echoed her own struggles, though in a different way. He'd mentioned sister and parents, words that stirred memories of loss she understood too well. Emily stood, stepping lightly toward him, careful not to disturb his private moment. But as she drew closer, a sudden gust of wind whipped through, yanking the silver bracelet from her coat pocket. It hit the ground with a faint clink, the sound ringing out in the stillness. The man, James, jerked around, his sharp, icy gaze slicing through her like a blade. "Who's there?" he snapped, clearly annoyed at the interruption. But when he saw Emily, a petite girl with shimmering eyes and a flustered expression, his anger faltered, replaced by a flicker of surprise. Emily bent to pick up the bracelet, but James was faster. He stepped forward, scooped it up, his rough hands cradling the delicate piece. "You dropped this," he said, his tone still cold but softer than before. His eyes flicked to the bracelet, a simple silver band, its etched patterns hinting at a history of care. "Thanks," Emily said quickly, reaching for it. But James didn't hand it over. He turned it in his hands, his probing gaze shifting from the bracelet to her. "Is it important to you?" She hesitated, caught off guard by the question. It used to be," she replied, her voice trailing off. "Not so much anymore." She wasn't about to tell a stranger it was a keepsake from David, her ex who'd walked away. But James's deep, searching eyes made her feel like he could see straight into her soul. He smirked, a faint sardonic curve to his lips. "Used to be important, yet you still carry it. You're a strange one." He slipped the bracelet into his pocket, his voice calm but firm. "I'll give it back later, when I feel like it." Emily's eyes widened, disbelief flooding her. "What? You can't just keep it, it's mine." She stepped forward, ready to demand it back, but James turned away, heading back to Lily's grave as if their conversation was over. "Don't bother me again," he muttered, his voice dropping low. "You've got no business here." But Emily wasn't one to back down easily. She cleared her throat, taking a chance. "I didn't mean to bother you, but I heard you talking about your sister. I don't know what happened, but I don't think you should hold on to this anger at your parents forever." James froze, his shoulders stiffening. He turned back, his eyes flaring like embers. "What did you just say?" His voice dipped, dangerous, like a beast roused from slumber. "Who are you to lecture me?" Emily swallowed hard, but held her ground. She met his gaze, her voice shaky but resolute. "I'm not lecturing you. I just think, if you keep blaming them, you'll never break free. I lost someone important because I didn't fight to hold on to them. Don't let that happen to you." Her words hit James like a gust through his frozen heart. He wanted to argue, to yell that she had no clue about his pain, but something in her eyes, a deep, genuine sorrow, silenced him. It reminded him of Lily, His little sister, who'd once said, "James, don't be mad at Mum and Dad. They love us." He hadn't listened then, and now Lily wasn't here to say it again. Seeing he didn't respond, Emily exhaled softly and stepped closer to the grave he'd been kneeling at. She read the inscription, "Lily Salvador, our little angel." A wave of emotion flickered across her face. Without another word, she took a daisy from her bouquet and placed it on Lily's grave. "For your sister," she said, her voice light as a breeze. "I hope she's at peace." James stood motionless, staring at the small white daisy resting quietly on the stone. This stranger's gesture threw him off balance. No one had ever done something like that for Lily. No one but him. "You," he started, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time in 3 years, he felt his heart stir, even just a little. Emily gave a faint smile, turning to him. "I don't expect you to listen to me, but if you ever want to talk, I'll hear you out. After all, we're just strangers, right?" She turned and walked off down the gravel path, her small figure fading behind the trees. James watched her go, his hand unconsciously tightening around the bracelet in his pocket. He didn't know her name, didn't know who she was, but her words and actions lodged in his mind. "Forgiveness?" he murmured, glancing at the daisy on Lily's grave. "What do you think, Lily? Is she right?" The wind rustled through, carrying the faint scent of daisies, as if Lily were whispering something from beyond. James wasn't sure he could forgive his parents, but for the first time he wondered, if he kept living in this anger, would he really be honoring Lily like he'd promised? And that girl, what had she done to make him feel, for just a moment, that he wasn't so alone? The early morning sunlight filtered through the leaves in Emily's backyard, scattering shimmering patches of gold across the ground. This garden had once been her mother Clara's pride and joy, a haven where she'd planted vibrant rose bushes to escape the days she battled illness. But now it was a neglected corner, overrun with weeds, the old flowers reduced to faded memories. Today, a new gardener had been hired to bring it back to life, and Emily never imagined it would be him. James Salvador, the enigmatic man she'd met at the cemetery. Emily stood by the window, her brown eyes fixed on James's tall figure in a simple black shirt. He was bent over, his rough hands wielding a small shovel, carefully digging to replant fresh flower beds. Sweat rolled down his forehead, dampening his messy dark hair, but his gaze remained cold and focused, as if the garden were his entire world in that moment. Emily couldn't look away. There was something about him, a mix of strength and solitude, that made her heart beat a little faster. "Good grief, look at him," she muttered, her fingers tightening on the curtain's edge. "How did Mum hire a gardener? This good-looking?" She chuckled, but the sound faded as she remembered the silver bracelet he'd kept from her at the cemetery. "Wait, don't tell me he's here on purpose to mess with me." She couldn't stay inside any longer. Pushing open the creaky wooden door, she stepped out. James glanced up, his eyes meeting hers for a split second before he looked away as if nothing had happened. "Morning, boss," he said, his deep voice flat and emotionless. Emily smirked, stepping closer with a mock confidence. "Morning, gardener guy. What's your name again? I don't think Mum mentioned it." "James," he replied curtly, not looking up, continuing his work. "You don't need to know more than that. I'm just here to do the job." Emily crossed her arms, tilting her head as she studied him. "James, huh? Doesn't sound like a gardener's name. You're not a pro at this, are you? Look at how you're holding that shovel, like it's a pen or something." James froze, his grip tightening on the handle. He turned, his sharp gaze sweeping over her. "What do you know about gardening to judge me?" His tone carried a hint of sarcasm, but the corner of his mouth twitched, like he was fighting a smile. Emily didn't flinch. She stepped closer, pointing at the flower he'd just planted. "I don't know much, but I can tell you buried that one too deep. The roots'll suffocate. Also, a black shirt in this sun. Aren't you hot?" Or are you just showing off those muscles for me? James narrowed his eyes, but this time he couldn't hide a faint grin. You talk too much. If I wanted to show off, I'd have taken the shirt off already. He turned back to his digging, but Emily caught his shoulders shaking slightly. He was holding back a laugh. She burst out laughing, feeling like she'd cracked the first layer of his icy exterior. Fine, you win. But seriously, you don't seem like a gardener. Where'd you come from? Why'd you take this gig? James didn't answer right away. He stood, brushing dirt off his hands, his gaze drifting into the distance, as if lost in thought. I wanted a change of pace, he said, his voice dropping low. You don't need to know more than that. Emily frowned, sensing he was hiding something, but instead of pressing him, she decided to test him another way. Then help me out with something. This weekend my family's throwing a little party. I need someone to spruce up the garden and maybe lend me a hand during the event. Can you handle that? James turned, his eyes narrowing as he studied her, searching for her real intentions. I'm a gardener, not a party planner. But you're my gardener, right? Emily flashed a sweet but challenging smile. I'll pay extra. Besides, I think you'll like it. My family's a blast. Maybe you'll find some fun in it too. James went quiet, his hands sliding into his pockets. He didn't want to admit it, but her words stirred memories of his own family. The warm days with Lily before everything fell apart. Fine, he finally said, his tone reluctant. But don't expect me to smile the whole time. Emily clapped her hands, beaming. Perfect. I'll hold you to that, James. Over the next few days, James didn't just work on the garden, he quietly transformed a neglected corner into a secret garden. He'd found Clara's old flower pots, forgotten in the shed, covered in dust and moss. With rare care, he cleaned them, replanting them with red roses, Clara's old favorites. He didn't tell anyone, not even Emily, working silently each morning as if it were his way of finding peace. One afternoon, as Emily brought him a glass of water, she froze when she saw him resting by a thick leather-bound book titled Modern Business Strategies. She set the tray down, her voice dripping with suspicion. James, be real with me. Are you a gardener or a businessman in disguise? That book's not cheap. James flinched, quickly closing it, a flash of unease in his eyes. I just like reading, he mumbled. Nothing weird about that. Just like reading? Emily crossed her arms, tilting her head. Don't lie to me. I've been suspicious since you kept my bracelet. You're not a regular gardener, are you? James sighed, standing up, his gaze darkening. What do you want to know? I'm here to work, not spill my life story. Emily stepped closer, her tone softening but firm. I'm not forcing you to talk, but I want you to be honest with me, even just a little. You've got me so curious, James. You show up at the cemetery, now here. It's like you're running from something. Her words struck a hidden chord in him. He looked at her, the coldness in his eyes giving way to a flicker of vulnerability. You're right, he finally said, his voice low and rough. I'm running. But not from you, from myself. Emily blinked, stunned by his admission. She wanted to ask more, but the pain and resolve in his eyes stopped her. Then, stay here, she said gently. I won't promise to understand everything, but I'm not kicking you out. James didn't reply, just nodded faintly and returned to the garden. But as she walked away, he found himself watching her, his hand tightening around the book. He'd come here to prove her perfect little family wasn't real, to dismiss her cemetery advice. Now, he wondered, was staying here a way to reclaim something he'd lost, not just for Lily, but for himself? That afternoon, Emily's garden bathed in the soft golden glow of the sun, the red roses James had secretly planted blooming vibrantly, their sweet scent whispering of life reborn. It was the day of the family party Emily had enlisted James to prepare, and the old villa buzzed with lively chatter and laughter. Relatives, from her newlywed cousin Sophia to aunts, uncles, and beyond, gathered in full force, sharing stories and warm embraces. Yet amid the cheerful scene, Emily felt a quiet unease as she glanced at James standing alone in the garden's corner, his distant gaze lost in another world. "James, want to come inside and grab something to eat?" Emily approached, holding a cold glass of lemonade, her tone teasing to coax him out of his silence. "You're standing there like a statue. People might mistake you for a mannequin." James turned, his cool eyes flickering with a faint smile. "I'm not hungry," he replied, his voice low and steady. "You focus on your guests. I'm done out here." He gestured to the garden, where neat flower beds bloomed like a painting. Emily frowned, setting the glass on a nearby wooden table. "Done, huh? Yet you're still hanging around. You're a weird one, James. I'm starting to think you're not just a gardener." She tilted her head, her brown eyes sparkling with curiosity. "Tell me the truth. Who are you?" James didn't answer, just stared at her silently. He started to turn away, but a familiar voice rang out from the gate, startling them both. "James, James Salvador, is that really you?" The trembling, emotional voice belonged to a silver-haired woman in her 50s. Rena, James's mother. Emily spun around, stunned to see Rena and George, James's father, stepping in with the crowd. They weren't strangers to her family. Clara had once mentioned Rena was her best friend from their days fighting cancer together. But what floored Emily wasn't their presence, it was James's reaction. He went rigid, fists clenching, his eyes igniting with a furious blaze. "What are you doing here?" George spoke up, his deep voice tinged with worry. "We've been looking everywhere for you. Why are you—" "I'm not your son," James cut in, his voice ice-cold and razor-sharp. "Don't call me that. You have no right to be here." He turned to leave, but Emily darted forward, grabbing his arm. "Wait, James!" she shouted, her voice a mix of anger and confusion. "What's going on? Do you know them? Who are they to you?" James pulled his arm free, his gaze darkening. "They're a past I don't want to remember. You don't need to know, Emily." But Rena wouldn't let him walk away so easily. She stepped closer, her eyes red and brimming with tears. "James, please listen to me. We don't want to lose you again. Lily. What happened to Lily wasn't our fault, or yours." At the mention of Lily, James whipped around, his glare fierce enough to burn. "Don't say her name." "Bah. Anno kamasin and masim," he roared, his voice trembling with pent-up rage and pain. "You abandoned her, left her to die alone. Don't feed me those lies." Emily stood caught in the storm of emotions, her heart pounding. It clicked. James was the man from the cemetery, the one carrying a grudge against his family she'd tried to reason with. But now a bigger revelation hit her. He wasn't just some gardener, he was James Salvador, son of the billionaire Salvador family who'd vanished from high society 3 years ago after his sister's death. "James, you," Emily stammered, her voice faltering. "You're Rena and George's son. You lied to me?" James met her eyes, a flash of pain crossing his face before the cold mask returned. "I didn't lie," he said hoarsely. "I just didn't tell you everything. I came here to work, to forget them. Guess I can't escape." Before Emily could respond, he pulled her silver bracelet from his pocket, pressing it into her hand along with a small scrap of paper. "Thanks for letting me stay," he said, his voice dropping low. "Keep this. It reminded me you were right. I shouldn't hold on to this anger forever, but I'm not ready to forgive." He turned and strode out of the garden, leaving Emily reeling with 1,000 questions. She unfolded the note, her hands shaking. James's scrawled words stared back. "I don't deserve your kindness, but keep this to remember, you're worth more than you think." Tears spilled down her cheeks. She wasn't mad he'd hidden the truth. She ached, knowing he carried a pain like her mother's, a wound of loss that wouldn't heal. Rena approached, resting a hand on Emily's shoulder, her voice choked. "Sweetheart, thank you for giving James a place to land. He left home after Lily died. We didn't know how to bring him back." Emily turned, wiping her eyes, her voice trembling. "Rena, he thinks you abandoned Lily. What happened?" Rena sighed, her eyes heavy with sorrow. "Lily was our angel. When I got cancer, she wanted to come with me to the States for surgery. We wouldn't let her. I was afraid she'd watch me die. She snuck out anyway, and then the accident happened. James thinks we didn't care, but we loved her more than anything." Emily fell silent, her heart twisting. She glanced toward where James had disappeared, feeling like she'd lost a piece of herself. He wasn't just a gardener or a stranger from the cemetery. He was someone she'd started to care about, even if she hadn't admitted it. Now, she knew she had to do something to pull him from the darkness, just as she'd been trying to do for her mother. "He'll come back," she whispered, clutching the bracelet tightly. "I won't let him keep running forever." Night draped the garden outside Emily's house in a silent black veil. The only sound the rustling of wind through the vibrant red roses James had once planted. After the family party the day before, when the truth about James's identity exploded, he'd left without a goodbye, leaving Emily with her silver bracelet and a scrap of paper scrawled with his tormented words. She stood by the window, her sad brown eyes peering into the darkness, clutching the bracelet as if it were the last thread tying her to that mysterious man. "Emily, why aren't you asleep?" Clara's voice came softly from behind, tinged with concern. She stepped closer, resting a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "I've seen you standing here for an hour. What's wrong?" Emily turned, forcing a faint smile to mask her feelings. "I'm fine, Mom. I'm just thinking about James." She paused, her voice softening. "I had no idea he was Rena and George's son. He hid so much from me." Clara sighed, settling into a nearby armchair. "It shocked me too. Rena told me about James once, a smart, strong boy who locked his heart away after Lily died. I never imagined he'd show up here as a gardener." Emily nodded, her gaze drifting to the garden, now a symbol of the fleeting days she'd shared with James. "He thinks Rena and George abandoned Lily, but Rena said it was an accident. I want to help him see that, Mom. I don't want him trapped in that pain forever." Clara studied her daughter, her eyes warm with understanding. "Then go find him, Emily. Don't let him keep running. I know you care about him, and I believe he needs someone like you to pull him out of the dark." Her mother's words lit a fire of resolve in Emily's chest. She couldn't sit still any longer. Throwing on a jacket, she grabbed the bracelet and James's note, then bolted out the door. She didn't head for James's home. She didn't even know where he lived, but to a place she felt he'd go. The city hospital, where Clara and Rena had once fought cancer side by side. When Emily arrived, the late-night halls were eerily quiet, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. She approached the duty nurse, asking for old records on Rena Salvador, a stomach cancer patient who'd recovered years ago. With help from a kind nurse, she was led to the archives, where she found a small USB labeled Rena Salvador's Memories. The nurse explained it was a video Rena had recorded for her family during her treatment in the States. Emily's hands trembled as she plugged the USB into a computer in the archive room, her heart pounding as the screen flickered to life. Rena appeared, gaunt, eyes shadowed, but her smile as gentle as dawn. She sat on a hospital bed, her voice frail but brimming with emotion. "George, James, Lily, I'm sorry I hid my illness from you. I didn't want you to worry, especially you, James. My boy, I know you're mad. I wouldn't let you come here. But I was scared you'd see me die. I wanted you to remember me strong, not weak like this." She paused, tears streaming down her face. Lily, you're my angel. I never thought you'd sneak out to find me. If I'd known, I wouldn't have let you go alone. James, if you see this, forgive me. I love you, I love Lily, more than my own life. Don't let anger blind you to our love, okay? The video ended and Emily broke into sobs. She wept not just for Rena's story, but for James, the man imprisoning himself in endless pain. She knew she had to find him, to show him this truth. She drove to the cemetery where she'd first met him, hoping he'd be there. And she was right. Under the pale moonlight, James stood by Lily's grave, his broad shoulders shaking, clutching an old letter, Lily's note from before she'd left. He muttered hoarsely, "Lily, I'm sorry, I couldn't protect you. I was wrong to blame Mum and Dad." Emily stepped forward, her voice thick with emotion. "James, you're not wrong, and your parents aren't either." He turned, his red-rimmed eyes wide with shock at seeing her. She held out the USB, trembling. "This is Rena's message. You need to see it. You need the truth." James hesitated, but finally took it. They sat by Lily's grave, watching the video on Emily's phone. As Rena's image appeared, James went still, his hands shaking. When she spoke of Lily, of her love for him, tears spilled from his eyes, streaking down the face usually so cold. He buried his face in his hands, sobbing like a child, his cries echoing into the night. "I didn't know," James choked out, his voice breaking. "I thought they didn't care. I thought they let her die. But she went because of Mum." Emily rested a hand on his shoulder, her voice soft. "Lily loved Rena, like I love my mum. She wasn't abandoned, James. She left because of love. And you're loved more than you realize." James looked up, his eyes meeting hers, free of their icy shield for the first time. He took her hand, his voice rough. "Thank you, Emily. You made me face what I couldn't." They sat there by Lily's grave until dawn broke. James stood, his gaze steady with newfound resolve. "I need to go home," he said firmly. "I have to talk to my parents." Emily smiled, still gripping the silver bracelet. "Go, James, and if you need someone, I'm still here." He nodded, then walked off, his tall figure fading into the morning light. Emily watched him go, her heart lighter but tinged with a quiet ache. She didn't know if he'd return, but she believed she'd helped him find his light, just as she was trying to do for her own family. Rain began to fall as James drove through the familiar streets leading to the Salvador family estate. Tiny droplets pattered against the windshield, mirroring the rhythm of his heart. Frantic, chaotic, yet for the first time in 3 years, carrying hope instead of pain. The video of his mother, Rena, that Emily had uncovered at the hospital last night, still echoed in his mind. Her every word slicing through the icy walls he'd built around himself. He'd been wrong. Wrong to blame his parents. Wrong to run from them. Wrong to let anger blind him to the love Lily had always believed in. When the car rolled to a stop at the estate's gates, James stepped out, letting the rain soak through the black clothes he'd worn since yesterday. He stood there, staring at the ornate iron gate, the symbol of the Salvador family he'd once despised. But now it no longer felt like a prison. He pressed the buzzer, his hoarse voice crackling through the speaker. "Open the gate." "It's me, James." The gate creaked open, and Rena bolted from the porch, her umbrella tumbling to the ground as she saw her son. "James," she cried, her voice breaking with tears, rushing to throw her arms around him despite the pouring rain. George followed, his eyes red, his steps shaky, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "You're back, James?" George asked, his voice thick with emotion. You're not mad at us anymore?" James hugged his mother tightly, then pulled his father into the embrace, his tears mingling with the rain. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I was wrong. I saw Mum's video. I didn't know Lily left because she loved you. Didn't know you hurt as much as I did. I'm sorry I ran away." Rena sobbed, clutching his shirt as if afraid he'd vanish again. "You don't need to apologize, James. Just coming back is enough. I couldn't bear losing another child." They stood there in the rain, holding each other in silence, letting old wounds begin to heal. After a while, James led his parents inside to the living room, the same room where he'd fought with them 3 years ago. He pulled Lily's letter from his pocket, a crumpled note he'd found in her suitcase after the accident. "I want you to read this again," he said, his voice low. "I couldn't face it before, but now I want us to remember Lily together, not with pain, but with love." George took the letter, his voice quavering as he read aloud. "Dad, Mum, James, I'm going to find Mum because I don't want her to be alone. Don't be mad at each other, okay? I love you all." He stopped, tears streaming down his face. "Lily, all she wanted was for us to stay together." James nodded, his gaze steady. "I won't let her down anymore. I want us to be a family, like Lily hoped." That night, alone in his old room, James watched the CCTV footage he'd refused to see after Lily's accident. The grainy image showed his little sister dragging a suitcase, sneaking out into the rainy night. She turned back to look at the house one last time, smiling, an angel's smile, free of blame. James broke down, but these were tears of release. He'd found his family again, and more than that, he'd found himself. But there was one thing left unfinished. At dawn, James drove back to Emily's house, his heart pounding with the decision he hadn't expected to make so soon. The rain still fell, heavier than the night before, turning the garden into a blurry watercolor. He stood at her door, soaked to the bone, clutching a small ring, the one from Lily's jewelry box, engraved with her name like an eternal promise. He knocked, and when Emily opened the door, she froze, stunned to see him there, hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes fierce yet tender. "James, what are you doing here? It's pouring out there." James stepped forward, his voice rough but certain. "Emily, I need to tell you something." He paused, took a deep breath, then dropped to one knee in front of her, rain drenching them both. "I used to think I didn't deserve love, didn't deserve happiness after what happened to Lily. But you showed me love can heal anything. You pulled me out of the dark, not just with my family, but with myself." Emily's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth as tears mixed with the rain. "James, you—" "Let me finish," he interrupted, his voice shaking with emotion. "I can't promise you the world. I've lost too much for that. But I promise to spend my life loving and protecting you the way you did for me. Emily, will you marry me?" She stood there, speechless, her heart hammering like it might burst. Then she threw herself into the rain, wrapping her arms around him, laughing through her tears. "You idiot! Who proposes in a downpour? But, yes, I'll marry you." James laughed, a real radiant laugh she'd never heard before, like sunlight breaking through the storm. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into a tight embrace, the rain falling around them like a symphony of joy. They stood there, drenched but warm, knowing they'd face every storm together from now on. As the rain eased, James whispered in her ear, "Thank you, Emily. You're my light." She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of the man who'd once been so cold, now open to her. 7 years slipped by like a sweet dream, and the garden at Emily's house was no longer the desolate patch it once was. The vibrant red roses James had planted had spread wide, blanketing the space and turning it into a little paradise nestled in the heart of the city. The old villa, once just Emily's family home, now belonged to them, James and Emily, a place where the laughter of their little daughter, Liliana, echoed daily, a melody that healed old wounds. Today was special, their 7th wedding anniversary and the launch of Lily's Light, a charity they'd built together to honor James's sister, Lily, and support families battling cancer. The garden brimmed with guests, friends, relatives, patients, and doctors who joined their cause. The lilting notes of a violin mingled with the scent of roses, weaving a scene of warmth and hope. Emily stood amid the crowd, her white dress fluttering in the breeze, her brown eyes sparkling as she watched James chatting with George and Rena near the rosebushes he'd once planted. He still carried that strong presence, but now his gaze softened with tenderness whenever it fell on her and Liliana. Their 6-year-old daughter, with long black hair and a smile eerily like Lily's, darted around the garden, clutching a bouquet of white daisies. "A gift for Aunt Lily in heaven," she'd said. "Mommy, look!" Liliana squealed, rushing to hug Emily's legs and holding up the flowers. "I picked these for Aunt Lily. Daddy says today's special, so I want her to be happy." Emily knelt, kissing her daughter's forehead, her heart swelling with warmth. "Aunt Lily's definitely happy, sweetheart. You're such a good girl." She glanced at James, catching his smile from afar, and a wave of complete happiness washed over her. But amid the joy, Emily held a secret. Her hand rested on her stomach, feeling the faint warmth of new life growing inside. 2 months ago, she'd undergone minor surgery after doctors suspected breast cancer, like her mother's. Thankfully, it was just a benign lump, and she'd recovered fully, thanks to James's unwavering care. He hadn't left her side during those hospital days, holding her hand, whispering that she was his everything. Now she wanted to surprise him, a gift to complete their little family. As the ceremony began, James stepped onto the stage, his deep voice resonating through the mic. "Thank you all for being here today. Lily's light isn't just a way to remember my sister. It's a promise that no one will face cancer alone, like my family once did. I couldn't have done this without Emily, who pulled me from the darkness and gave me a real family." The crowd applauded, and James looked at Emily, his eyes shining with love. She smiled, stepping up beside him with Liliana, her hand trembling as she took the mic. "I have something to say too," she began, her voice catching. "James, you always call me your light, but you don't realize you're mine too. These past 7 years, you've stood by me through every hardship, even when I thought I'd lose everything." She paused, took a deep breath, and grasped his hand. "2 months ago, I was terrified I might have cancer like my mum. But you never let me face it alone, and I made it through. Today, I want to give you a gift. Another baby will join us in a few months." The crowd erupted, cheers and applause filling the air, but James just stood there, stunned. Then he laughed, pulling Emily into his arms, hugging her tightly in front of everyone. You're serious?" he whispered, his voice shaking with emotion. "God, Emily, you've made me so happy I could lose my mind." Liliana squeezed between them, shouting, "I'm getting a sibling. I want a brother to play ball with Daddy." The family burst into laughter, and James scooped up his daughter, his eyes misty but brimming with joy. The ceremony ended with smiles and hugs, but as the guests dispersed, James pulled Emily aside to the garden where the red roses glowed under the sunset. He knelt, not to propose like 7 years ago, but to whisper a new vow. "Emily, I once thought I didn't deserve this happiness, but you've given me everything, a family, a purpose. And now another child. I won't let you fight alone, like you never let me." Emily smiled, tears streaming down her cheeks. She took his hand, pulling him up, and leaned into his shoulder. "You don't need to promise, James. You've kept that vow every day for 7 years. I love you, and I know Lily's smiling down on us." They stood there in the garden, now a symbol of love and healing, watching Liliana scamper around with her daisies. The sunset painted the sky gold, and her giggles blended with the breeze, a testament that their happiness wasn't just a dream, but an eternal truth. As night fell, James whispered in Emily's ear, "Thank you for everything." She smiled, her hand locked in his, knowing that no matter what lay ahead, they'd always have each other, like the roses that bloomed through every season. How do you all feel after James and Emily's happy ending in Chapter 8? From James's pain of loss, Emily's resilience, to the red rose garden witnessing their love and healing, this journey closes with Liliana's laughter and the hope of another child. But is their story really over? What do you think about exploring new challenges for the Salvador family in the future? Will James keep his sunset promise, or will Emily face another storm? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts on this final chapter. What moment hit you the hardest? Hit that like button if you loved this sweet conclusion, and subscribe so you don't miss what's next. I can't wait to read your feedback. It's your support that keeps me creating. Let's keep dreaming up beautiful stories together, okay?